Hello and welcome to Antimatters. Today we have what I hope will be the most complete guide available for Myrmica rubra, otherwise known as the European fire ant. They closely resemble Myrmica rugonodes, and to the amateur keeper like myself are completely indistinguishable except by location and altitude, with rugonodes filling a more northerly highland niche. They are my favourite species of ant and I've been keeping them for at least 3 years, but have been finding their nests for a lot longer, and nothing beats the feeling of turning over a big old rotten piece of log and finding a heaving mass of these girls. They were the second species that I kept after everyone's favourite beginner species, Lasius niger, and I'd say apart from their escape abilities, require a similar level of care, and the only real difference is Vaseline that will contain Lasius nigers is easily traversed by rubras, so PTFE, alcohol and baby powder or lids are essential. You could also use oils of different kinds like olive oil, vegetable oil, they apparently work. I use PTFE because it's super easy, but if you know how to use baby powder, it is a lot cheaper. My colonies currently consist of a 3-year-old fully matured 6-queen, 4,000 worker plus nest, which is producing elates, a 500 plus 2-year-old colony, which isn't producing elates yet, and a 200 worker and at least 1 queen splinter colony of my larger colony. Just to make it clear, I don't know everything about rubras. For example, I've yet to find out whether colony size, availability of food or colony age, or a combination of all three dictates the late production. The splinter nest should answer some of this for me in about a year though, because they've only got 200 workers, but they are they'll be about 4 years old by next year. And if they do start producing elates, I'll know it's because of age more than the size of the colony is. My 500 plus work colony, they haven't produced any yet, but they're only about 2 years old. An overview. Myrmica rubra are beautiful light red to mahogany and every shade in between. When freshly enclosed, they are a creamy yellow callow, which darkens over a few days. They have a very active and outgoing lifestyle, spending a lot of time out the nest. Usually they'll either be scouting for food, a drink, or finding a new place to set up base. They're also a very forgiving species and readily able to accept new nests and environments. This makes them a perfect species for beginners. But they are more than capable, due to polygamy, of keeping an experienced keeper busy. You may often hear them described as aggressive, but that is completely untrue and a complete exaggeration in my opinion. They are more than capable of cohabiting a nest with other insects and invertebrates such as woodlice, centipedes, millipedes, beetles, worms, and even small spiders, without any form of aggression. I would instead describe them as highly defensive. They're a lot like a bison protecting their calves. They have no issue putting themselves between their children and death. In the event something threatening does come between them and their babies, they will try to kill it in a heartbeat. I'll cover this behaviour and how I feel it's leading to misinterpretations during feeding time, and the evidence that I use to make this hypothesis during the diet section of this video, and freely invite feedback and other points of views. Rubras do have a sting, and according to other sources, it's like a stinging nettle. Simply put, unless you have an allergic reaction to their bites, you'll be absolutely fine. I have no idea personally how it feels, and I'm not convinced they can get through my skin, as I've been covered many times and got 0 bites, even on my forearm. It kind of makes me a bit sad that I haven't had the chance to get hold of this forbidden knowledge yet, but maybe one day they'll sting me good and I can totally experience it. I can totally imagine on a small animal, the sting is more than capable of causing significant pain and removing threats, which is more in the ballpark of what it was designed for. Physically, Myrmica rubra are a medium to small ant, with the workers and microgynes coming in between 4 and 5 mm long, and the macrogyne queens coming in at 6 mm. Unlike most species, they have 2 sizes of queens, the bigger more dominant macrogynes and a microgyne that closely resembles the workers in both size and coloration, although is usually slightly yellower. It can be difficult to tell the larger queens from the workers, so as you can imagine, spotting the microgynes is near impossible. To make it even harder, they perform many of the same functions of workers in a nest, so merge into the crowd seamlessly. The only positive identifiable feature I have found is the barbs on the rear of their thorax. Only workers have these spikes. You can tell the larger queens a lot easier. They have slightly darker coloration on their head and usually have a dark brown thorax, which is larger than the workers. If you look really closely, you can often make out wing scars, which only royalty have. All casts of this species have serrated mandibles, and when full, workers' gasters will also gain a yellow tip. Although unlikely, the workers of this species are capable of laying unfertilised male eggs as well. This is normally prevented with pheromones through the queen. How and where? Rubras are polygamous, meaning they will readily have more than one queen per nest. When founding a nest after a nuptial flight, as many as 100 new queens may shack up together. This seems to bring in increased survival rates compared to solo founding queens. This may be due to the fact that they are semi-claustral. If one queen goes out and gets a meal, she may bring back 110% of her needs, and some other queen can gobble up the spare 10% when she's not looking, etc. Once founded, they are also polydomous, meaning they have multiple nest sites and will move between them freely. You'll often find their nests in soil, under rocks, or in rotten logs near waterways that flow through meadows and grassland. Some say they prefer east-facing banks as well, due to them getting warmer earlier in the day when the ambient temperatures are at the lowest. Geographically, their range extends from the UK and Europe down to the Mediterranean Sea and east Kazakhstan. They are also considered an invasive species in North America and Japan, where they seem to be expanding their territory rather quickly for a non-tropical species. In Europe, this species is also a host to the parasitic Alcon blue and scarce large blue butterfly that trick the ants into thinking their caterpillars are ant babies and get a free meal ticket for life. Rubras like a nest temperature somewhere between 19 and 24 Celsius, which means that they'll do fine at room temperature. They do really appreciate an external heat source though, and will bathe in a warm area en masse. If you do choose to heat your ladies, make sure you keep a thermal gradient by only heating one area of the nest and leaving the rest unheated. This will reduce the risk of them getting baked. They're also super keen on high humidity, and an ideal nest should be between 60 to 90% humidity. Personally, I sway on the wetter side of this humidity, as if it's too high, they'll get a bit damp at worst. If it's too dry though, they'll keel over and die in no time at all, and that's definitely not what you want. If possible, you want an outworld to have quite a high humidity as well, which can be done by keeping them damp. If you can't do this, a few test tubes of water in the outworld will give them a retreat if they feel they are getting a bit dry. Rubras will accept nests of most material as long as they can be kept humid. White-tongue and natural setups are best because they can retain the most moisture, but acrylic and 3D printed with an absorbent substrate like cocoa fibre or soil will work fine. You can also get some specially designed 3D printed nests that focus on high humidity, and they would make a fine home. Diet. Most importantly, and as with all ants, fresh water should always be available. They can last months on a few crumbs, but only a few days without water. They may not seem to touch it when sugar water is available, but it's still super important for both your peace of mind and their continued security. You never know when your sugar water will go bad or just be rejected. I've had it many times where they just don't like the ratios of sugar and what I've put in it, and will mostly avoid the sugar water and move over back to the water. In nature, Myrmica rubras will farm aphids for honeydew, and they'll also collect pollen from dandelions in early spring before the plants have matured enough to sustain many aphids. The aphids are also sometimes farmed subterraneously and suckle on roots. Through testing out loads of different combos, I found mine enjoy a light syrup of refined white sugar and glucose syrup, and it stays fresh for a good week if need be. They'll also take brown sugar and honey along with fruit. Most colonies have different preferences on sugar, so it's definitely worth trying loads of different combinations. Just avoid sweeteners and fruit skins due to pesticides. I also like to colour my sugar water with food colouring. 1, because it looks cool, and 2, so I can tell it apart from the water as they're both clear. They will also accept pretty much any source of protein, that be insects, chicken, protein jellies or fish. If they can get into it, they'll munch it down. Avoid dead insects you find outside, as you never know what killed them or where they've been. Definitely worth getting some feeder insects if you can from a trusted source. A good choice are flightless fruit flies for young colonies, and crickets, roaches and mealworms for bigger colonies. This bit might get a bit controversial, but I'd 100% no excuses to be made recommend pre-killed insects. In reality, they are primarily scavengers and have no real need or love of live prey or the hunt. I hear a lot of people say they really benefit from live feeding, and I've done it many times, but there seems to be no measurable benefit to it. The same amount of work has come out. They get the same food at the end of the day, and they just have to do a lot more work for their supper with risk of mortal injury. And also, your queen, if she does poke her head up, she's going to see this bug out there, and she's going to turn around and scamper back into the nest, so you're not going to get to see her as much. They're 100% happy eating dead insects as long as they're fresh. My evidence for this statement comes as inevitably some bugs, usually mealworms, you have killed aren't actually dead and rise from the grave like Jesus. The ants will eat the dead ones, but being sufficiently full, they'll leave the living mealworms to go on living. They don't harass them, they don't mob them, they just ignore them, like any other insect. When you see a rubra colony mobbing a living insect, it basically means a combination of they've not been feeding them enough protein through neglect or a controlled diet to control their population, normally the predator. Another factor to consider is this bug just fell out the sky, could be a threat, smells completely foreign and is terrified. All the bug wants to do is leave, all the ants want it to do is leave, and the one thing it can't do is leave. Of course they're going to get peeved off and defensive. What these ant keepers are really seeing when they put a living insect into the feed their Myrmica rubras is the physical embodiment of stress with zero benefit, in my opinion. There are cases where they will hunt to avoid starvation as well, but those are not normal circumstances, and many animals will eat things wildly out of their normal healthy diet to survive. Humans can and have eaten each other to avoid starvation, and that is definitely not considered normal behaviour. Personally, I feel as a more mentally developed species, or as the most developed species in the equation, it's our responsibility to reduce the amount of stress and suffering where possible to all people involved, because we simply, well, we can. We have the mental ability to reduce stress, so we should. This also carries over to your feeder bugs. Treat them well if you know how. Founding. From nuptial flight to a mature colony normally takes around 3 years. I'm going to start from the beginning of a queen's life and show the journey to a mature colony and hopefully give you some idea of the structure of their lives. It's about June, July-ish, and a new princess emerges from her cocoon. She was laid about 2.5 months prior in April, once the previous overwinter generation had hatched and bolstered their ranks. She has 4 glorious wings, each about the length of her body, and is held under house arrest the majority of the time. Late July swings by and the queens are faced with their first decision. There are 2 options for a young princess. She can stay within her mother nest and get fertilised there. She can stay on as an additional queen to the mature colony. It's completely possible some colonies have been rotating queens like this for hundreds of years. Alternatively, she can spread her wings and fly to a far off place and meet new faces, creating a new dynasty stemming from her. For the sake of this story, our queen is going to fly. Anywhere between late July and the end of summer, she is allowed to leave the nest without being dragged back in by the workers. It's a beautiful warm summer's day with a gentle breeze, and it rained earlier, creating a nice soft substrate to found in. In the space of a few hours, millions of her kin will take flight on one of multiple nuptial flights in order to propagate her species across the land. Most will mate on the wing, but some may fall to the ground copulated. The vast majority will never make it to their first nanitic. Birds, spiders, wasps, pretty much everything is out to eat them. But some lucky ones will make it, and our newly coronated queen will be one of those lucky ones, sort of. She finds a suitable area to land and comes in like a wrecking ball. Other fresh royalty is scattered on the floor around her. Looks like she'll have company when found in. As she's crawled into a dark alcove with her new friends, the shadow of a colossus covers her. Bruised bog trotter comes thundering across and looks down at them. His glass fingers wiggle, and all of a sudden, our queen is inside of Brucey boy's test tube. Luckily, Bruce knows how to use Google, so figured out how to create an artificial claustral chamber, aka a test tube setup. They don't necessarily have to be a test tube setup, in fact. Boiling tubes are actually better for this species. Alternative founding styles exist and are just as valid, mostly with special tubes or petri dishes, but I prefer boiling tubes. He then places her in a dark place where she will not be disturbed for at least a week. Side note, if you ever need to change tubes with this species, light and heat are your best option. Heat a tube to 23 Celsius and darken it, and leave the tube you want her to move out of exposed and unheated, and she will move over quickly, in most cases. Touch wood. Our new queen is semi-claustral and may extremely rarely choose to lay eggs before winter, but normally in spring after hibernation, which takes place between late October and April. When hibernating this species, they should be kept at around 5 to 10 Celsius and avoid freezing temperatures, as they will die. If she does lay eggs before hibernation, it's advised to give her a little protein such as a dead fruit fly every 4 weeks and a tiny portion of sugar. Honey on a tiny cotton ball works well. Avoid drops of honey alone, as the queen could have an accident and potentially drown in it, which nobody wants. Continue this every month over hibernation so she doesn't get too hungry. Overwinter brood develop super slow and require a tiny sliver of nourishment. Although in 99% of cases she will wait for spring before laying her brood, and until this happens her food intake is pretty much nothing. It never hurts to give her 1 or 2 fruit flies before she lays, but there's no need to replace it till she's had eggs. Weekly feeding, a little protein and sugar should be enough for her once it's spring and her brood has arrived. If you see her food is going bad as well, just take it out and she won't starve overnight, and put some fresh in whenever it's next scheduled. Now it's spring and Bruce has got a test tube full of eggs, and it's getting a bit tricky as it's warm now to feed the queen in the tube, as the heat makes her more excitable and faster. Time to think about attaching an outer world or create a tubs and tubes setup to facilitate easy feeding with minimal disturbance. This can be done when she first lays, but has minimal benefits as she requires so little attention. As the eggs turn into pupae, her protein intake will increase, and thus the benefit of an outworld where you can put too much food and not worry about mould spreading into your test tube setup is beneficial. It's also a good time to think about adding a dedicated water drinker to the outworld if possible. From egg to worker seems to take about 2.5 months in this species. This is often the most stressful time for ant keepers, as they are so fragile when it's just a queen with a pile of brood. One wrong move and it could all fail in an instant, but once you're through it, it's pretty much plain sailing. Avoid worrying too much and disturbing her, and all I'll say is inaction is the best action. 2.5 months later, boom, Dinty nanitics start emerging. They'll only be about 3mm ish long and are very fragile. They're super cute though, if you get to see them. From now on, the nanitics will take care of the brood and take over the majority of the foraging. The queen will now focus on getting ready to lay another pile of eggs. At this early stage of development, it's good to remember that the nanitics will struggle with tough exoskeletons, so chop up larger insects or use fruit flies as they have a weak exoskeleton. Once the nanitics are fully up and running, expect a large wave of brood before autumn. These will be the overwinter brood and will develop into next spring's workers. Depending on the number of queens, this brood can be quite numerous. Brucey's queen is now 1, has a few nanitics and is preparing for its second hibernation. Checking and feeding them is pretty much the same as the first hibernation, but feed them every 2 to 4 weeks due to the new brood. It's now spring and your rubras have awoken, so your second generation is nearly here. At this stage, I'd consider adding in a dedicated sugar water drinker. It makes maintaining their sugar source a lot easier than cotton wool and honey. It just takes up a little bit more space. They need changing at least weekly too. This is to avoid fermentation, as alcohol and ants really don't mix. It's time to really feed them up after hibernation as well, as this will feed the brood up nice and strong, and these workers should come out a lot larger than their previous sisters. Zip forward a few months and you may find a few nanitics have passed away. This is normal behaviour, as they aren't really built to last like their future sisters. They're small and delicate and live in the few months range as opposed to a few years. Your second generation of brood should be hatching about now. and it's a good time to consider a nest upgrade. Something not too big, but bigger than a boiling tube, as they will be cramped in there before too long. Nests with chambers you can open at a later date are a great choice here, as you can keep access to the required space only, and keep all the unrequired space closed off and clean. A natural setup is also a fab choice, although you lose the ability to see your queen and brood development, although they can build a chamber any size they want. So it's been a year and a half since she left the nest. The second generation are hatching after overwintering. She's got dedicated drinkers for water and sugar and a small nest and outworld. You can now sit back and wonder at your accomplishment. The colony has now passed the first and worst hurdle in any colony's life, founding. Although risks still remain, such as fungi and parasites, they are unlikely to kill off your entire colony, and they can start sculpting their environment to reduce these risks with behaviour like nest cleaning and grooming, now that they have adequate staff. Once the second generation have all emerged, it's time to inspect brood. This third generation should be considerably bigger than previous broods, and will expand the colony a lot. You should have got to know your girls well by now, and learn their preferred foods etc. to keep them healthy. It's also a good time to give them a larger nest or expansion. Due to their polydomous nature, they will happily spread their nest over numerous sites. It's also at this stage you may begin to see a few male elates, as they can sometimes creep into the third generation of brood. You normally won't find princesses till at least the fifth generation, because they have slightly higher demands that just don't get met with. Once matured, you should be left with a beautiful colony you can watch for hours. So when you're sitting back watching your colony, you might want to know what you're watching. These girls don't make graveyards or trash piles like some other species. They have undertaker behaviour, where they will pick up a dead/dying ant. Ant death seems to be controlled by pheromones, and they don't actually have to have died to be considered dead, as long as they have the death pheromone. Copyrighted trademark band name. You can't have it. The undertakers will then attempt to get 3+ meters from the nest to dump it. As you can imagine, not many people have 3 meters plus of room in their setup, so this leads to a lot of problems. They will carry the bodies around and around for potentially days until dumping. It's highly recommended to try and clear out these bodies weekly, even with a cleanup crew of bugs present, before your ants devote too much energy to this impossible task. These ants recruit mostly by mass recruitment. Basically, one ant will find something nice, run back to the nest laying a pheromone trail, and get all her sisters excited, and then come back with a whole bunch of them and heal. Sometimes the queen will come as well. They are ample swimmers and can survive for over a day floating on water. To achieve their buoyancy, they tend to sit up on their gasters and use their forelegs to potentially guide their trajectory. They are also more than capable of drowning in a water drop though. Due to woodlice maintaining a clean shell, ants will often climb aboard their backs to perform self-grooming, thus avoiding the dirty floor. Mature polygamous nests have no problem splintering into smaller separate nests if you wish to reduce the queen count. I've done this to my 7 queen 4K worker colony in hopes of slowing their growth next season as they filled their nests. I laid a pipe with PTFE to stop them climbing the outside between 2 nests, and after a few days and a definite macrogyne queen moving in, I removed the pipe and hey presto, I now had 2 colonies. They will also very rarely jump. This seems super rare and I'm not even sure they know that they're doing it, but their body does possess the ability to jump around their body length. That's all for today's video. Thanks for watching and hope you have a nice day. I'll see you next time.